and I am pleased to welcome you all here to this first of 10 events that have been organised by a range of nuclear trade associations who are presenting a whole range of different issues relating to nuclear energy and climate change. And this one is giving an overview on nuclear energy and its contribution to how it can combat climate change. With me today, I'm very delighted to have two guests. On my right, on your left, Maria Korsnick, who's President and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute. And on my left, on your right, Jessica Johnson, who is the Advocacy and Communication Director at Nuclear Europe. So we'll be hearing from those people in just a moment, but to begin, we will have a short video from Sama Bilbao, who is Director General of World Nuclear Association. Can we play the video, please?
Hello, I'm Sama Bilbao, Director General of World Nuclear Association. I am delighted to welcome you for the first of 10 events to be held at the Atoms for Climate Pavilion that have been organized by World Nuclear Association, the Canadian Nuclear Association, the Japan Atomic Industrial Forum, the US Nuclear Energy Institute, Nuclear Europe, and the UK Nuclear Industry Association, in partnership, of course, with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Access to energy is integral to modern life. Indeed, access to affordable, clean energy is regarded as a fundamental human right by the United Nations, as outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals. And given the centrality of energy to the well-being of citizens, this leads to the energy trilemma of providing energy security, equity, and environmental sustainability. The fundamental aspect of energy security is to ensure an adequate and resilient energy system that can withstand disruptions or price shocks at an affordable price to everyone in society. Nuclear energy can play an essential role in addressing all these challenges. Today, as we speak, more than 400 nuclear power reactors are providing people across the world with 24/7 carbon-free energy, independently of geopolitical pressures, the weather, or the season. They have an incredibly small footprint in terms of land, fuel, and raw materials use, as well as the lowest life cycle impacts of all electricity generation options. Today, the percentage of electricity that comes from low-carbon sources, which is 37%, has almost not changed since the mid-1980s. Currently, only countries that produce most of their electricity from hydropower, geothermal, or nuclear, or a combination of those three, have successfully to decarbonize their electricity grids. With global electricity use expanding at least 50% by 2050, and the global population projected to increase to almost 10 billion, it is crucial to use cost-effective and proven solutions that provide secure access to 24/7 low-carbon electricity. Historically, nuclear energy has proven to be the fastest way to increase population's access to electricity. It is immune to severe fuel market fluctuations while also being able to operate for at least 60 to 80 years. Nuclear energy is recognized as one of the most affordable, secure, 24/7 energy sources currently available. But beyond electricity, which accounts for only a fifth of total energy use, nuclear energy enables rapid decarbonization via dispatchable low-carbon heat. This heat is ideal for industrial processes, district heating, and hydrogen production. If we are to keep the Paris Agreement's 1.5-degree target within reach, in a cost-effective and socially equitable manner, we urgently need significantly more nuclear energy. New build rates for new nuclear need to ramp up to 50 gigawatts per year over the next 10 years and keep up until 2050. And now, more than ever, it is crucial for governments to put in place pragmatic policy actions to facilitate and accelerate the deployment of nuclear. Such actions include establishing a level playing field for all low-carbon technologies and reforming energy and electricity markets to recognize the security and reliability of nuclear energy. The program of events here at the Atoms for Climate Pavilion will provide an opportunity to discuss the contribution nuclear will need to make to meet our environmental goals and deliver access to resilient energy supplies. I hope you will have the opportunity to take part in them here when you are in Sharm el-Sheikh or online.
And thanks very much there to Sama for her remarks. You can come back into the room. Should be with us just a moment, and I'd now like to hand over to Maria Korsnick for your opening remarks. Maria, please.
Can you hear me now? Great. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. You know, I've been in this industry for 36 years, and the opportunity for nuclear has never been like we are seeing today. And it's not just in the United States, it's really around the world. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us, but it's just not going to be something that happens. It's going to be something that we're going to have to work together to make happen. The conversation really today is fundamentally different than it was even just a few years ago. I know in the United States, for example, at the state level, if even a few years ago we had just a few pieces of legislation that were working themselves through state legislatures, that would have been a big deal. Today we find that there's over 100 pieces of legislation that are working through state houses that have something to do with nuclear. At the federal level as well in the United States, you might have heard about the recently Inflation Reduction Act that passed. It supports both the current nuclear fleet with a tax credit, and it also supports a future build of nuclear with a production tax credit or an investment tax credit. You heard in Sama's remarks, one of the things that she was asking for was a level playing field. Well, in the Inflation Reduction Act, nuclear is treated like any other carbon-free source. So one would argue it is creating a bit of that level playing field, that the same investment tax credit that other carbon-free sources would get apply to nuclear. So that's a fantastic platform upon which that we can build. And you know, we talk so much, when we think about decarbonization, we talk so much about electricity. One would argue that electricity is actually the easiest thing to decarbonize. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be the easiest thing. And for us to really win in this climate game, we have to decarbonize the whole economy. That means manufacturing, that means transportation. It's more than just the electric sector. And that's what's beautiful about nuclear, because nuclear can play in the hardest to decarbonize, which one would think is the manufacturing sector, because it can produce very high temperature steam. It could also produce hydrogen, both of which will be very important for that manufacturing sector. So the investment in nuclear not only is an investment in carbon-free electricity, it's an investment in a carbon-free economy. It brings with it well-paying jobs. It brings with it a more affordable electricity. It brings with it energy security. So when you step back and you look at the whole equation, a partnership between wind and solar, nuclear and hydro, really forming the backbone for the carbon-free future, is the best solution across the board. From a policy perspective in the United States, we've really benefited from both support from Republicans as well as Democrats. And there aren't too many things you can get Republicans and Democrats to agree on in Washington, D.C., but nuclear power is one of them. And they come to nuclear perhaps for different reasons. The Democrats a little bit more for climate change. The Republicans a little bit more for national security, perhaps, and energy security. Both sides come for the jobs that nuclear brings. But what's important about having the bipartisan support that we're enjoying is that a long-term solution for nuclear, it's going to take many years. Not only do we have to begin to build, but we need a sustained building program. And that means it has to withstand several different administrations. And the fact that we have that bipartisan support should give all of us confidence that there's rigorous foundation upon which nuclear can build. I think that's very important for the sustained progress that we need to make. What's very exciting right now for nuclear is that what I call the innovation pipeline, but the innovation pipeline of sort of new things in nuclear, well, it's full. And that innovation pipeline is going to be bringing new makes and models and things to the market over the next 5 to 10 years. And these new innovations in the form of small modular reactors or micro reactors or mini reactors and large reactors are really going to be a wonderful opportunity for us to have sort of more tools in the toolbox, if you will, for nuclear to see how it is that nuclear can play an even larger role in the climate solution. So I look very forward as we think through how is it that we can solve the many challenges for climate, just how big a role that nuclear can play in this conversation. It's going to be a wonderful opportunity to work together across the world in order to bring nuclear to its full potential and helping solve our climate challenges. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maria. Now if I can pass the mic over to Jessica, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I've not been in the nuclear sector for as long as Maria. I've been around for 5 years, but I'm based really at European level. And we have seen quite a big transformation over the last 5 years in terms of how people talk about nuclear. What is clear for us is very often you hear it's either nuclear or renewables. At the end of the day, the challenge that we have to meet in terms of ensuring that we have enough energy, not just electricity, but enough energy available to us, means that there is room for all technologies, as long as those technologies are going to be the ones that are going to take us where we want to be. And in the case of Europe, it set itself the target of decarbonizing its economy entirely by 2050. I think this is part of the reason why today we are seeing more of a transformation in the conversations and a recognition that yes, perhaps the system that's based on renewables plus nuclear is the one we need, is because when we're talking 2050, in the past it seemed like a long way off. Let's be clear, we've got less than 30 years to get there now. So the reality is starting to kick in, and there's more scientific work being undertaken, and more, I think, policymakers are starting to ask themselves the question, okay, this is my original ideological belief, but there is this challenge, and there is the scientific work out there that shows that nuclear is part of the solution. Maybe I should start to reconsider that. And that's what we're starting to see filtering through member states, European member states. What does this mean? It basically means, we have, so as I said, we've got this challenge. We need to decarbonize by 2050. But at the same time, over the last 2.5 years, we've had this kind of energy crisis already bubbling beneath the surface. So it has been there for some time, but indeed it has been exacerbated by the recent crisis since March of this year. The result of that is the kind of question that people are asking themselves, okay, we've set ourselves this target, decarbonize by 2050, but we have two other problems today, and these are really affecting Europe. Security of supply. Europe at the moment is still very, very heavily dependent on imports of natural gas, coal and oil. So how do we, apart from the fact that they are CO2 emitting, how do we also wean ourselves off those fuels and make sure that we have a European supply of energy? And the second one, affordability, because this is the other problem we're facing now. This winter, there are millions of families in Europe who may have to take the decision, do I feed myself or do I heat my home? We are literally at that stage today. And again, that's something, if you are less dependent on external imports and you're producing your own energy, you can have some control over the cost of that energy. And there are studies out there, yes, renewables is one of the great ways to go. We need renewables, and we need to get as many renewables on the grid as possible, as quickly as possible. But we also need to have the technologies that are there to back them up. And that's where nuclear comes in. And again, if you are able to ensure that you've got your own energy that's being produced, you're stabilizing the cost because you're not depending on these external factors. So I think one example, I will give you a member state where the ideology is still sitting there and where unfortunately because of that situation, they, I would say, are not that close to meeting the targets, is Germany. Germany today, I mean, already it has been shutting down its nuclear fleet with the goal of completely phasing nuclear out by the end of this year. It still has 3 reactors connected, but the goal was they would be shut down at the end of the year. And what they've actually had is, instead of reducing their CO2 emissions, what they've been doing is building renewables capacity, and that renewables capacity has been replacing the nuclear capacity. So they've been replacing low carbon with low carbon. The gas and the CO2 emissions linked to the gas have still been there. Look where we are today. They are considering keeping potentially 2 of the reactors on standby mode. We have yet to see how that would actually work. But what they're actually doing is they are reopening their coal-fired power plants. And so their emissions are escalating. It shows how, I think, as policymakers, sometimes we respect that you can have an opinion over a technology or not, but if you have set yourself the goal to decarbonize and you're trying to set yourself as an example on how to decarbonize, that means taking some tough decisions. So even if you don't like a technology, if really your goal is to decarbonize, and the only way you can do that is by including that technology in your energy mix, then you really need to decide, am I serious about meeting that goal, or am I going to stick to the principle that I don't like nuclear and I want to phase it out? And that's what we're seeing in Germany at the moment. Other member states, the Netherlands, for example, Sweden even recently, they're going in the opposite direction. They were looking to phase out nuclear, and now they're saying, okay, let's keep our fleets running as long as possible, and now let's look at how we can invest in new nuclear reactors. Why? Because these member states are basically saying, okay, our biggest challenge today is tackling climate change. And we need nuclear in order to do that. So even if in the past we may not have supported nuclear technologies, the reality today and the science today tells us that nuclear has got to be part of that mix. Otherwise, 0 carbon targets are just never going to be met. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Now, what I'd like to do at this point is just present some information about what nuclear energy is doing today worldwide. And I'm going to take that information from a report that World Nuclear Association produces. It's another example of a great collaboration with the IAEA, because it is one where we use their PRIS data and then add to it and produce this report every year looking at how nuclear energy is working. So we can start with this first slide, which I hope you can see now. And that showed that in 2021, nuclear energy produced 2,653 terawatt hours of electricity. That's up 100 terawatt hours on what was produced in 2020. Nuclear generation, apart from 2020, when we had the pandemic and the electricity use across the world began to slow down, every year since 2012, apart from that, nuclear generation has increased year on year. And that 2,653 terawatt hours represents 10% of the world's electricity produced with very low greenhouse gas emissions across the whole life cycle and very securely. And it's produced with a very high capacity factor. This is a measure of how much electricity does one generation plant produce compared to the theoretical maximum it can produce. And in the case of nuclear reactors, that is around 82%. And that's one of the highest capacity factors seen for any form of generation. So you have very secure supplies with nuclear generation. And if we can go back to that first slide, please. Thank you very much. You can see that that generation has come from 436 reactors, and that's actually down 5 from 2020. Although in terms of capacity, the capacity only dropped by 1 gigawatt. And that's because reactors that are being built today, reactors that have been built in recent years, tend to be larger than those built in the early days of the industry. So as the older reactors are being closed down, the average size of reactors in the nuclear fleet is going up. But still, that is an example of how capacity is really holding steady and has been holding steady for quite some time. There are 53 reactors under construction around the world. That's up 4 on the previous year. And in fact, construction started, I think, on 10 reactors in 2021. But reactors shutting down, there were 10 that shut down as well. So we're left with a situation where we're starting new construction, but at the same time, reactors are closing down because they're reaching either the natural end of their operating lives, or they're being closed down because of political decisions. Decisions to phase out, such as the ones in Germany, where reactors which could feasibly generate for another 20 years, 40 years, could still be in operation. So if we go on to the next slide, please. And this is just an indication about how nuclear energy has improved its operation since the 1970s. So in this chart, you can see capacity factors for reactors for the decades 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and so on. And in the 1970s, around about 24% of reactors managed to get a capacity factor higher than 80%. Today, it is more than 2/3 of reactors are achieving that. So we're getting more electricity, better performance out of reactors, and that's one of the reasons why electricity generation has been able to carry on increasing, despite the fact there hasn't been the same increase in capacity. So more electricity from the same number of reactors. And if you can go to the next slide, please. This shows the evolution in ages of reactors since the 1970s. So, of course, really we only really hit a big build rate for nuclear reactors in the 1970s, or the first one came online in 1954, but that's when the major expansion in nuclear capacity happened. So you can see, as time has gone on, there has been new build, but there is that big wave of construction that happened in the 70s and 80s that's still contributing to quite a lot of the overall installed capacity of reactors. And in fact, in 2019, we had the first reactors reach 50 years of operation. Nevertheless, the vast majority of reactors are less than 40 years old. And for most of those reactors, the technical possibility for those reactors is that they could operate for potentially up to 80 years. So most reactors in operation today haven't even reached middle age. And all these reactors have the potential to contribute to generating electricity for that period that Jessica outlined, the fact that we've got 30 years until 2050, 30 years to hit net zero. All those reactors in operation today can contribute to achieving that goal, and many of them will still be operating in 2050. Now, that compares to the planned lifetime for a solar plant or a wind turbine, which is at the moment around 20 to 25 years. A very small percentage of the solar panels or the wind turbines in operation today are going to be contributing to generation in 2050. Of course, a massive number are being built now, and capacity is increasing very largely, but it is one advantage of nuclear generation that you do have these very long lifetimes for the plants. Once you've built them, they stay in operation. If we can go to the next slide, please. And the question is, how do those older reactors perform? Do we see a decline in their performance? And the answer is no. If you look at this chart, this is showing the capacity factor for reactors from 1 year old to over 50 years old. And you can see that basically the line is a straight line. A reactor that is coming up to 50 years old, on average, generates with that same high, round about 80% capacity factor as reactors that are in their first decade of operation. So we've actually seen the capacity factor of the older reactors improve over time, rather than declining. And that is a very good signal that there is the potential for reactors to keep on generating even longer. We see no decline in their performance, and they will be able to supply electricity at good performance levels into the longer term. So I can see the next slide, please. And this shows construction times for reactors, the ones that came online in 2021. And there is a big difference. There is a reactor at the top there that actually took over 10 years to construct, but there are others that take less than 6 years. And in fact, the median construction time over the last 5 years or so has been around 6 years, 7 years to construct a reactor. So there are examples when reactors take longer than that, and it really is incumbent upon the nuclear industry to demonstrate it can deliver reactors on time and on budget. But there is the potential for a very large expansion in nuclear capacity to take place over the next 30 years so it can contribute more to helping combat climate change alongside other low carbon energy sources. And if I can see the next slide, please. And this, in fact, is the last slide. And what you can see there is that there has been new build ongoing, and the rate has started to pick up again in the last few years. But what we also are seeing is reactors being shut down. And as I said, often that is because of a political phase-out decision rather than a decision to go ahead and decide to close them because they've reached the end of their natural lifetime. And that's a real problem if we are serious about combating climate change. Here in the room, for those online I'll have to describe it, here in the room we've got the chart showing the global electricity generation mix at the moment. And at present 10% of electricity comes from nuclear, 8% comes from solar, wind and tidal. There's around 3% that comes from other smaller scale renewables, and around 16% from hydro. And in total that gets you to around about 36-37% of the electricity generation, with 63% still coming from fossil fuels. And the big problem for the world, if it is serious about combating climate change, is that that 63% has stayed roughly the same for 20 or 30 years. Despite all these meetings we're having at all the COP venues that have been, we're at COP27 already, the percentage share of fossil fuels in the electricity generation mix has held steady. We're not making progress, so we need to do a lot more using all the low carbon generation options, because we are simply not swimming against this tidal stream we have of this use of fossil fuels. We need to do so much more with everything. And it's even worse than that, because while the percentage share has stayed the same, the amount of electricity being produced has gone up dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years, and it is continuing to increase. So actually the total amount of fossil fuel generation in absolute terms has gone up very dramatically over this period where we have tried to be taken action on climate change. So that's why I think it's essential we use all low carbon options. We look to build them faster. We can build them faster in the case of nuclear generation. We've achieved 30 gigawatts being added to the grid in the 1980s. We could do that again. We could do even more. And we are going to need to do more if we are going to truly get carbon emissions down and reach net zero by 2050. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to that, and we're going to move on to some questions. And I will be looking for questions from the audience in the moment, but I wonder if I could just ask a couple of questions to both of my colleagues here on the stage. So Maria, you outlined some of the challenges there are at the moment in terms of financing, development of new technologies, but let's say we can solve the gateway to nuclear generation, we can get that commitment to new build. If you wanted to start up a large new capacity of nuclear generation in the US, what would be the additional challenges of actually making that happen?
Thanks. Well, there's a couple of challenges. We're going to need people, so I think there's a workforce challenge. We're going to need people to build, and then you're going to need people to operate. Supply chain will be a challenge. There's going to be lots of things to build, and we're building at one site currently in the United States, and building that site has created some supply chain issues. So if you can imagine building many more, we're going to need to ensure that that gets worked out. And honestly, since COVID, it seems like we've had supply chain issues all across the economy. And so, you know, you would imagine that those would be a challenge. I think the regulatory process, I'll speak to the United States first, you know, has been used to a relatively sort of slow and sluggish nuclear industry. We haven't been building. And I think to change that to a much higher rate of build, I think we're going to need to get the regulator sort of on pace for that. And that's just in the United States. Actually, our regulator works with regulators around the world. They partner, they talk to each other and collaborate. So you can imagine, not only are we going to do more in the United States, but we're going to build more nuclear around the world. And so I think globally there'll be a pressure on the regulatory systems of all the different nations to kind of work through this efficiently. And so I could probably go on. I guess the challenge really is, do we just step back and say, okay, it's just too hard? those are big challenges. Sort of what do we do with that? Yeah, it is going to be hard, but it's not insurmountable. It's hard in a way that we got to put our heads together and we have to figure it out. And I think a good example of that right now is the Canada and US partnership. Each country is interested in approving the same design. It happens to be a GE Hitachi design for a small modular reactor. So it's a wonderful example of how two countries, both very interested in a similar type, and they want to get it through their regulatory process. I think this is a great example of can they partner, can they work together to do that efficiently. So I think there's some great examples in the very near term of things working together. We talk about the workforce. We also mentioned that there's many coal plants when you went through your percentages of fossil fuels. Well, I think naturally you're going to see some of these coal plants closing. And from my personal experience, when I ran nuclear plants and I worked at nuclear plants, we invited the folks down from the coal fleet to work with us on our refueling outages. So those coal plants that you're closing, I look to that as a wonderful workforce that can be repurposed at nuclear plants. So it's not just we have to start from scratch and figure this out. I think there's a lot of repurposing of talent that we have today. And that's a beautiful story because when you close these coal plants, it can leave devastated communities behind. If you repurpose them and they work at, say, a nuclear plant, maybe a small modular reactor, not only do the workers have these great jobs, but they also have the thriving communities that they currently live in today. So it becomes an economic just transition. And so I think there's so much positive about nuclear. Again, not going to be easy, but absolutely doable.
Thanks very much. And if I can pose a similar question to you, Jessica. I mean, in Europe as a whole, there is a little bit more build than there is currently in the US and North America as a whole. But nevertheless, I'm sure there are particular challenges in Europe related to getting new build programs going.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in Europe in the 1970s and 80s, if you look at France in particular, they had a massive new build project, if I could put it that way. So they were building one reactor after the other, and as a result, you had this whole supply chain that was set up. People wanted to work in the nuclear industry. So there you really saw that the challenges were not as important as they are today, if I can put it that way, because of course they had this massive rollout of reactors across France and across other European member states, but in the last 20 years there's not really been many new build projects. I mean, probably count them on one hand, to be honest with you. And so what was the supply chain that was there, that was set up, it's either moved elsewhere or it's had to diversify to other sectors. So there is a challenge there if you're saying, okay, France now, it has been announced, France is now looking to build 6 new EPR-type reactor technologies, so the large reactor technologies. So they're looking to do 6, and potentially an additional 8, be they the large ones, be they potentially the small modular reactors. So what France now needs to do is to say, okay, so do I have the supply chain to do that? What is already good there, and I think that is one starting point in all of this, is you need the political message. You need policymakers to come out and say, we see this technology as part of our future, and we're going to do this on a long-term basis, not short-term, switch governments, change our mind. No, let's really look at getting this going on a long-term, and over the next X number of years, we're going to roll out this number of reactors. That's already giving confidence to the investors. So investors are saying, okay, it is worth investing in this technology to help start building it because it's still going to be around and it's, my investment is worthwhile and there's going to be a return on that investment. But it's also sending the message to the supply chain to say, okay, if I decide that I want to start supplying components to the nuclear sector, I know there's going to be several reactors built, and therefore over the next 10, 20 years, I know that I have a market for those components. And then you have that third one, which is, again, something that Carol spoke about. It's the skills issue. And three different groups of stakeholders have a role to play in that. First of all, policymakers. If they're going out there and they're saying to their citizens, to the young people, there is a future for nuclear in our country, you're saying to them, okay, so there's an opportunity for a job in the nuclear sector if you're interested. That's the first thing that we need. But we also need to have the industry going out there and explaining what the nuclear sector is about and why it is interesting to work in the nuclear sector. So it's also about us attracting people to come and work in our sector. And it's not about attracting them once they're already at university and they're already doing PhDs or whatever. It's also about attracting them at secondary school level. Because it's at secondary school level that a lot of students already are thinking, okay, so what area do I want to work in? And this is the third area for me. I think all industries today, in particular in Europe, are struggling to recruit people. It's not just something that's affecting the nuclear sector. You speak to all manufacturing sectors, and they all have the same problem. There's not enough students going into the traditional STEM subjects at university. So I think as a whole, there's that third message. What we need to be doing is all working together to make the STEM subjects look attractive to secondary school students. They then go into that subject at university, and then as an industry, we make our industry look attractive to them, and then they can start to specialise in the different industries. But at the moment, we all seem to be fighting for a very small pool of people. Why not work together to have a much larger pool of students in relevant subjects at university, and then you will have the people that you'll need to come and work in your industry. But it's about working together. It's about the industry as well being presenting itself as an attractive industry, and it's about policymakers saying, if you decide that you want to specialise in nuclear, you have a guaranteed job for life. So there's a role for everybody in all of that. But it's coming back to something that I think is really important. At the moment, everybody's still working in their own little silo. We all need to do this together. I mean, decarbonising, it's not about one country, it's not about one industry, it's about the entire economy. And you often find all these events and these initiatives happening, but they focus only on one technology, or they focus only on one area. Everybody now needs to sit around the table and say, okay, we've got this massive challenge. We need to decarbonise by 2050. We need to ensure security of supply. We need to make sure that we've got the skills that we need. We need to make sure that the investment is there. How can we all working together do that? Be that with civil society, be it with the NGOs, be it with the policymakers, be it with the industry. Let's all sit around a table and have that conversation, because in my personal opinion, that is the only way we're going to really start putting measures in place that are going to get us where we want to be in 2050.
Thanks very much, Jessica. If I could now, I'd like to turn over to any questions we have from the audience here. Question at the back, please.
Hello, Sandro Mozo from Chile. My question is that when we are talking about atoms for climate, are we still only considering fission and not fusion? Only fission?
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, so the question was, are we considering both fusion and fission? I do know that there's actually quite a bit of funds that are being put into fusion today. So I would say that there's definitely a lot of research that's underway. I don't personally have a view in terms of how quickly that research can actually come to reality, but there's definitely a lot going on in the fusion industry as well today. So in the same way that I talked about the innovation pipeline for fission, which has been very, very active. In the United States, it's really been a partnership between our national labs and the private sector that has really brought a lot of these opportunities to the fore. So I think we're actually blessed with a lot of interesting new makes and models that are going to come to the commercial availability in the next 5 to 10 years. And just to say that, I mean, there is, so the main project for the fusion side is the ITER project, which is, I mean, the EU is investing in it, China, US, there's a whole range of countries and regions that are putting funding into that. But I think in terms of fusion, we're looking, it's an innovation, so we're looking at 2050 potentially, when that would come to the market. And I think the climate challenge is already there. I don't think that
we shouldn't be waiting for these new technologies. So fusion is there, and in the future it will be part of the solution. Batteries for large-scale storage for renewables, again, they're being developed, and hopefully at some point they will be available on the market. But we mustn't ignore what we already have today. And nuclear is a technology, nuclear fission is a technology available today, the same as renewables. And so we need to continue to invest in those technologies. And yes, in future, when technologies come to the market, yes, let's get them going. Climate is not going to wait for those technologies. So let's use what we already have available today and continue investing in new technologies for the future.
Thanks very much. Do we have another question? I see two from this side. Henry, pick one from this side, please.
Thank you. Dr. Charlene Smith, nuclear energy analyst at the Breakthrough Institute. You touched on several barriers to entry, including policy making, and the current lack of engagement between the public and the private sector. For NGOs like the Breakthrough Institute, who are working to communicate the urgency of nuclear energy technology deployment to the regulatory body, the NRC, by putting out prospective articles or reports. In our recent one, it's called Advancing Nuclear Energy, that talks about different scenarios of what an energy mix could look like, the ones that achieve our net zero goals by 2050 if we mix certain energy sources, and the ones that don't. How can we put these types of assessments or models forward for policymakers to use them as a resource to inform their policy making?
Really good question. And in fact, I guess my experience has been that policymakers are very hungry for some scenarios and for some numbers, if you will, because it's sort of been very easy to invest over the last decade plus in wind and solar, and people are investing in wind and solar expecting that we're making all this progress, but as he showed us on the graph, it's actually a very small percentage when you just invest in renewables. We really need that teamwork between renewables and nuclear. And so there's a variety of ways, panels such as this, to get the message out. I see the American Nuclear Society represented here in the audience. I know they're very effective at also getting information out. We hold those kinds of sessions ourselves. We put things on our websites. We engage at the federal level. We also engage at the state level. Any of these resources, such as what you're mentioning, are things that we refer to and we can talk about with policymakers. I've, myself been involved in congressional hearings where you can pull out this information and talk about it. So I think the fact that you're producing this information, I think Breakthrough actually has a pretty good connection with a lot of the NGOs. I know we work with you as well. And so I think it's just sort of continuing to do that and to get the information out. I'll be honest, I think the public and private sector have actually worked pretty well together on nuclear. I think the two advanced reactor demonstration projects that are underway right now, I think that's $1.2 billion between that the federal government has put up. That will be matched by the private sector, and those are for reactors that should be online by the end of this decade. I think that's a real strong demonstration that the government very much wants to work with the private sector to bring new things to market.
Thanks very much. We take another question, perhaps this side.
Thank you very much. My name is Haruki Yamamoto. I'm a university student in Japan. I belong to an NGO and I came here today. Thank you very much for the discussion. Because I'm from Japan, I want to ask you that do you have any expectations for Japan? Because Japan has, in Japan there was a nuclear power plant accident in 2011. And there, people are still struggling with the accident, the plants where accident happened. And also, at the same time in Japan, there's a move to revive nuclear power plants in Japan. And what do you think about that?
Well, I was just in Japan in July, and I testified before the Japan Atomic Commission with very clear expectations for Japan. We're very interested in Japan to team together with the United States, with other countries, to very much bring their nuclear facilities back online. I think you have 10 reactors in operation today. You have many more that you are working to bring back. And we're very much interested in Japan to be at the table with us as small modular reactors and other innovations are being brought to the market. Appreciate the challenges that occurred with the Fukushima accident. I think the whole world has learned lessons from that. I think it's very much time to get past it. The climate challenge is a challenge for the whole world. And I think it's just time to turn the page.
Thanks very much. Let's take one from this side, Henry, and let's go to the back row.
Hi, Charlie Nevin from the University of Sheffield. I'm a PhD researcher looking into nuclear waste disposal. And you've spoken a lot today about the problems facing the nuclear industry from a political and a technical point of view. But I think one of the biggest challenges is the social aspect of it, because there's a lot of misinformation and myths around the nuclear industry. So what are your organisations doing to sort of combat the misinformation, and what do you think we can do if we are in the nuclear industry and we want to combat that?
Thanks for the question. Let me turn to Jessica first.
Thank you. I mean, first of all, as an industry, the nuclear industry has to be transparent. We have to be there to answer questions. Very often we find ourselves talking at people when actually what we should be doing is just saying, okay, what concerns do you maybe have? What questions do you have? Come to us, ask them, and we'll try and answer them as best as possible. Also, I think what the nuclear industry has not always been as great in doing. I think the NGOs or those who oppose nuclear, they have been very good in their messaging. They keep it simple, they keep it quite impactful, and I think that's where it got quite a lot of resonance amongst the audience. So I think as an industry, and like all industries, the nuclear industry is gradually trying to be much simpler in the way it communicates, and giving an illustration that really resonates in people's mind. You mentioned waste. At Nuclear Europe, there is a video up on there, comes through in a loop at some points. What we discuss a lot about at EU level is what is known as the circular economy for waste. And so what we always found ourselves doing as an industry was talking about radioactive waste in a very nuclear way. What we do now, we said, let's talk about nuclear within the perspective of the circular economy. So what we said, okay, circular economy, it's reduce, it's reuse, it's recycle, and it's handling the residual waste. And so we now explain to people what we're doing in order to reduce the amount of waste that we're generating, how we reuse it within our own industry, how we recycle it in other industries and other applications, because that also happens. And then finally, for that very small volume, but of course highly radioactive waste, how are we dealing with that residual waste? Like, for example, the deep geological repositories. And so we are now framing that within a conversation that's happening around us. And that is, I would say it means that people, when we say circular economy, they automatically know what that is in their mind. And as an industry, we need to do more of that. We need to be present, but we also need to allow people to come to us, as I said, because that is one of the keys here. As industries, we have this tendency of talking at people. Let them come to us. Let them ask us their questions. We're here. Our doors are open. Please ask us the questions that you have.
Yeah, thanks. I would just add to that you know, as a nuclear industry, I think sometimes, you know, people shy away from a conversation around waste. And, you know, I guess my thought would be hold your head up high. this industry has been the most responsible for its waste stream than any. You see this pie up here about other people and how they generate electricity. Well, you know, very few of them have decided ultimately how to deal with their waste stream. And the nuclear industry has to deal with that from the minute you build the plant, right? You need to understand that you're going to create waste. We know exactly where it is. We know exactly what it is. Yes, do we have challenges to understand what the long-term sort of house is going to be? Yes. I think people also have a view that the volume of waste is just, you know, sort of astronomical. So I'll just point to the United States. You could take all the waste we've generated from commercial nuclear power for over 50 years, and it would fit in one Walmart store. So I think when people understand that, they're like, oh, wow, okay. It sort of demystifies it. So I think one of the things that we really need to do is just be more conversational and, as she said, you know, invite those questions. You know, ask people, you know, sort of what it is and what's on their minds. Oftentimes, you know, I talk about the fact I have 2 children. I was pregnant, working at nuclear power plants for both of my children. I felt incredibly comfortable doing that. You know, and so you make it personal, right? And you talk about that, and you say, yes, it's a very safe place to work. And so, anyway, I just feel that for many, many years, I would say nuclear, maybe we were too quiet on some of these issues, and I think when we were quiet, it led people to think, oh, there must be something, you know, there must be something there. The reality is, I think as an industry, we should be very proud, and we should be proud to discuss it and understand that there are long-term solutions to things around waste. I love the way that she described it, and nuclear is a beautiful way to create an awful lot of power with actually very little waste generated. It's the whole energy density of nuclear that makes it such a wonderful resource to use.
Thanks very much, Maria. I'm afraid I can see there are still some questions here, but we are right out of time, and I'm very keen that we have an on-time delivery of the wrapping up of this session. So I know that we have another 9 events happening over the next 2 weeks. The IAEA is organising many events as well. I encourage all of you here at COP27, all of you who are watching online, please do come along to those other events, engage. I hope we can keep the conversation going. But for today's event, thank you very much, everybody. I hope it's been informative and enjoyable.